Howdy y'all, I'm Fran with the Developer Relations team here at WP Engine, and in this video we're going to create a Headless WordPress form with Gravity Forms and WPGraphQL with Gravity Forms with our choice of front end, which is going to be Nuxt and Vue today. Now, Gravity Forms is a WordPress plugin that allows you to create a variety of forms on your WordPress site. Its large selection of add-ons lets you send collected form data to various CRMs, process data, and much more. Now, in this video, we're going to learn how we can query for Gravity Form data, render the form in a Nuxt.js application, perform field validation, and submit the form entries to our Headless WordPress backend. Now, I'm going to provide a finished Nuxt.js app repo that contains the Vue Components, the Vue composables, and helper functions that you can use for your own projects and experiment with. So let's dive right in. Now let's start by setting up our WordPress backend. I've already spun up a WordPress install on my hosting provider WP Engine, and you can use whoever hosting provider you choose to. You could also use Local by WP Engine, which is a free development server that spins up a WordPress install in a dev environment. We've got that spun up now. There's a couple of things that we have to do. The first thing is, of course, the Gravity Forms plugin. Now, this plugin is a paid proprietary plugin, so you would have to navigate over to their website. This is their website. You would have to create an account, and once you create an account and pay for a license, they give you the zip file to download the plugin, as well as the license to activate the plugin. So I've already done that, as you can see here. Now, WPGraphQL is a free WordPress plugin that extends your WordPress install as a GraphQL server, and you can find that on the plugins page if you search for it. If you go to add new plugins, if you're not familiar, and then just search for WPGraphQL. And it should populate up here, and there it is by my main man, Jason Ball. All right. Now, the last thing that we need to install is the WPGraphQL for Gravity Forms plugin made by David Levine. Shout out to David. And that you need to go directly to the GitHub page. You're going to navigate to the latest release, which is down here on the right-hand lower side of the page. Once I click on that, you want to click on this here, the actual WPGraphQL GravityForms.zip file is what you want to download on your machine. And once you go back here, you can add the new plugin. You can go to add new plugin, and you're going to want to upload the plugin, and it'll allow you to choose the file, and I've already done that. So that's all set. Now, I've already created a form. Actually, I haven't, but my good friend, Kellen Mace, has in an old previous Gravity Forms video he did, and we're going to use the same one. But this is the repo that I have for this demo, and I've added the JSON file right to the root of the project. So if you click on the JSON file, and then you just download the raw file, and once you download that, I've already done that, you can go to the Gravity Forms settings on the left and choose new import export actually, and this allows you to export a file from your local machine into it. And what's going to look like is when you go to Forms, it's going to set the form to active automatically. It's the only form in there. It's called Questionnaire, and when I click on it, it has all the fields that Kellen created in his previous video, which is an address field, a checkbox field, a date field, email field, a multi-select field, a name field, phone field, another checkbox field, a drop-down field, a text box field here, and then another text field. There's a time field here, a website field, and a short strings only field, which requires validation there. So we have that all set up. This is our form, And now what we're going to want to do is make sure it's exposed through the GraphQL server. So let's create a simple query and see if the JSON comes back with GraphQL. We can test our query in our WordPress admin because WPGraphQL comes with a GraphQL IDE that we could use once the plugin is installed. So I'm going to click on it up here to open the drawer. And here, I've already created a query. Let's go ahead and paste this simple query in and go ahead and go over what is happening in the query. So to query for a form, we have the gform query here that we named that we can use to query for data about Gravity Forms. It's a simple example. So what's happening is we're asking for form data. The gform query retrieves a specific form by its database ID, which in our case is 1. For that form, the query fetches basic information like its title and description, and the query also fetches the form fields, and for each field, it checks whether it's a text field or a select field, and it depends on the type. It'll fetch the appropriate data such as ID, type, label, and for select field, it will also retrieve the choices with their text and value. Now let's press play and make sure it works, but just one more thing, don't forget, we need our variable here to tell GraphQL which form we want it to expose as far as data is concerned. I can't get the variable up. There it is. And it's our ID of 1. That's our form ID. When I press play, the expected behavior is happening where I'm getting the title, which is questionnaire, and the description and all the form fields, the ID, the type, and you can see the data that's coming back from our form here. So this is great. It works. I'm stoked. Now you're probably wondering, just in case, hey, where do I get that form ID, Fran? Well, that's easy. It's just over in forms. When you click on it, there's the ID there, and that's where we get it. It's 1. So whatever that is, you could have a different one. You can just put in as the variable to grab the form data. Now it's time to start creating our front end that's going to fetch the data from the API, Backend WordPress, and our WPGraphQL for Gravity Forms server, and then expose that data with on the client, which is going to be today. We're going to use Nuxt.js, which is the full framework that's built on top of Vue. Now, this is awesome. Vue and Nuxt is very seamless, easy to use. I personally love it. So let's go ahead and start it with the utility command here. All we have to do is copy this here. And then I'm going to open up my Visual Studio Code and then paste this in the terminal so we can get the boilerplate started. Let's call this gforms headless WP Nuxt.js. Okay, and that's the utility command that's pulling down the boilerplate code we need for our Nuxt project. There it is. We're going to use, it's asking us a couple of questions. So which package manager would like to use? We're just going to use NPM for this example. And we are going to go ahead and actually, yeah, we'll initialize a Git repository for this. Great, it's all set up now. Let's make sure it works. So we're going to change directory into our gforms. Okay, and then let's make sure that this is working. So we're going to run the development server, and this should be off port 3000 on the browser. So localhost 3000. Great, it works. And then let's just make sure that once we open the files here, opening the file here, we just want to make sure that the routing and everything is wired up and working. So we visited the default home page, which is this app.vue file. But what we're going to do is we're going to make a pages directory, and then we're going to dump in a home page in there. So let's do that. We're going to delete this, which is the page that we saw when we visited localhost 3000. So we'll delete that. And then we are going to create a pages directory. And then in this pages directory, we're going to make a Vue component called index.vue, which we're going to use for our home page in this instance. And then it's going to be a template. Whoops. Okay, that should work. Now, let me start up the dev server again. And then when I go back to localhost 3000, there's our home page, hello world. Okay. Now the next thing we're going to go over is we're going to go over the file that's going to house our GraphQL request, our mutation, and all the logic to make this work, querying for the form data and submission. Before we start creating the file that runs our fetch request logic and the GraphQL mutation, let's shore up a couple of things that we need to do first. Now, I'm going to style this a little bit, and this is not a CSS tutorial, so I'm going to use Tailwind, and obviously there's a couple of dependencies that I installed preemptively here. I installed our GraphQL dependency, and then the Nuxt.js Tailwind package, because I'm going to use Tailwind to style this. So just FYI, I created a layouts folder, and in this folder I created a default.vue component that renders our layout across all the pages. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out is that we do need our environment variable, which is going to be our WordPress endpoint that Nuxt will be able to hit and fetch the data from. So let's go ahead and create a file called .env. And in this .env file, we're going to put the key and value pair, which is going to be, it's going to be Nuxt public WordPress URL, and this is going to be whatever your endpoint, GraphQL endpoint is from your WordPress install. Now we're ready to create the composables in Nuxt, and the first one we're going to start with is our file that's going to run our fetch request and our form submission mutation with our GraphQL queries stored in there. So let's go ahead, and at the root of the project, we're going to create a folder called composables. And in this folder, let's have a file, and we're going to call it useGravityForm.js. Okay, let's add the code that we need to make this file work. So first, we're going to import ref from Vue, and this allows us to create a reactive state within our composable. And then we're going to add this line here, and that is the runtime config from Nuxt's app context. Now we're going to use this to grab our WordPress URL from the environment variables. And then next is we're going to declare our composable function, which is going to be our default function here. Okay, and it's going to be called useGravityForm, and everything inside here is going to be encapsulated and reusable across our app. And here I call the useRuntimeConfig to get the runtime config object, and this gives us access to config.public.wordpress URL, which I'll show later. Next is a reactive array form fields initialized to empty, and this will hold the array of fields definitions we get back from WordPress. Now I define a big GraphQL query string, and we'll call it form query. Now this fetches the first 300 fields of our form, grabbing shared values, label is required, etc. via interface fragments plus type-specific props like choices. Now it's time to fetch. So I have a const called fetchForm here, and in fetchForm I start by logging the request right here that we're making a GraphQL request, and then this allows me to debug the URL in query. Now I call Nuxt's useFetch here in this code block right here. We're going to call Nuxt useFetch. This is their function to fetch data, help with data fetching, and then we're going to point this to our WPGraphQL endpoint right here. Now in the body, I'm going to go ahead and place our variables and set the immediate here to false. And what that will do is it'll control it when it fires off. And then I'm going to use transform here to unwrap errors and extract the nodes array. Finally, down here, we have this return statement, and these return the fetch helpers, data, status, fetch error, plus execute to run the request and refresh it to call it later. Now, next up, what we have to do is the transforming form field values into the shape the Gravity Forms expects when submitting entries. So let's go over this const here, which does exactly that. Here's the transform field value, and then I turn on a switch statement out here, and this will give the field's type and build the proper payload shape. So we have the checkbox arrays, we have the address object here, then we have down here the email values, then we have the name field values, or it defaults to a value string here. Getting down to the final lines of code here, let's wire up a submit form to send a mutation back to WordPress. So here's a submit form function, which is async. And we're going to map over and loop over the field values. Entry. Then we're going to find its corresponding field object right here and call our transformer and filter out any null entries. Okay, lastly, we're going to go ahead and build our mutation and call fetch again. So up here, we've built our WPGraphQL for Gravity Forms GraphQL mutation. And as you can see, we're matching the API's submit gform API. And then we're call and asking for errors, confirmation, and enter data. Now, down here, we call fetch again. And this time, this is going to be with our mutation, and we're going to parse the JSON here. Now, if the API does return errors down here, we're going to throw. Otherwise, we hand back the gform data down here. And that's it. We're done with this file. Stoked. Next up, let's create our useFormFields.js helper, and this is going to be the file to dynamically map each Gravity Forms field to the proper Vue component. We're going to do this in composables, so I'm going to create a, not a file actually, but not a folder, but a file, and let's name it useFormFields.js. And then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start by importing a defined async component from Vue. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to let us lazy load each field component on demand. Next up, let's go ahead and set up an empty component cache object. And once we load a component for a given field type, we'll start it here, so future lookups are pretty instant. Let me go ahead and put that in here. Now let's map each field type string, which corresponds to this .vue file name, in which will be our components/form fields. which we'll create next. Now notice that we're going to reuse the input field for text area, text, email, and website. Now let's go ahead and export a composable function useFormFields, and inside it we'll define our resolver. Now I'm going to add logged types set to log each new field type once, and this is handy to verify which types actually flow through in your form. Now here's a resolved field component, and it takes a field object and returns an async Vue component, or null if it's unmapped. Now we're going to drive the field type by preferring field.inputType right here, if present, and then falling back to field.type and normalize to uppercase to match our keys. Now, on first encounter of a type, if we log it for debugging, then register it in logged types so we don't spam the console. Now, if we already loaded this type, return it immediately to the component cache. Otherwise, look up the component name in our type to component map. If found, call define async component here with the dynamic import of that file, cache it, and then return it. Now, if that type isn't in our map, we're going to go ahead and simply return null. Now, you might render a fallback or throw an error in this case. Now, finally, we expose resolved field component from useFormFields, and any page or component can now import this and dynamically render the right field component based on GraphQL data. Now let's go ahead and build our Vue components that are going to render the fields out. And let's start with the input field.vue file that is responsible for the 4 fields that we stated earlier. Now I'm going to create a folder in components. So let's just create a components folder first. And in the components folder, I'm going to create a subfolder called form fields, which is going to house all our Vue component files. Now, let's go ahead and create one called inputField.vue. And then let's start to build this out here. Now we're going to wrap everything in a div class field wrapper for consistent spacing here. And then our label only renders if field.label exists, helpful for fields like HTML sections without a label. Then we bind to field.databaseID. So clicking the label focuses the input. Now inside the label, we interpolate field.label right here and show that a red asterisk when field.is required is true. Right over here. Now this input right here has dynamic ID type, two-way vModel, placeholder, and a required, all driven by our props and computed values. And I've applied Tailwind classes for styling and focus states. In the script setup, we import computed from Vue, our go-to derived reactive values. Then we declare 2 props, field and the entire GraphQL field object for label, placeholder, is required, etc., and then model value, the current value string supporting vModel on this component. Then we set up emit for update model value so vModel works seamlessly. Now here are our two-way binding magic here. We have get and set. Getter returns props.modelValue, and setter calls emit update model value val. Now following that, we compute the HTML type attribute, and if input type or type equals email, use email. If it's website, use URL, and otherwise we default to text for any other string input. Now we define a simple fallback default placeholder to guide users when the field's own placeholder is empty. Now lastly, right here we scoped our CSS and we give it a dot field wrapper, a consistent bottom margin, keeping our form layout pretty tidy. And that's our consolidated input field.view. This will handle text inputs, emails, websites, and any single line field using just one component. Let's create now a barrel file in the form fields subfolder within the components directory. So let's open up a file here. And we're just gonna, this will be the index, which will act as the barrel file. Okay. And then the code that we're gonna have is gonna be a bunch of export statements like so. Now, rather than walking through each of the remaining 8 files one by one, where you'd see that there's similar patterns, right, of props, labels, and inputs, I'm going to spare the repetition. Each of these components follows the same approach as input field.view, and they accept a field prop, they map GraphQL data to view bindings, and render with consistent styling. Now, having a deep dive in the code is in the repo, so feel free to explore there. And we kept components like address field, name field, date field, and time field, if you notice, in their own files because their unique input structures and rendering logic, like multiple sub-inputs, calendars, time pickers, it doesn't fit cleanly into a single generic component, so we kept those separate. But the overall purpose, before we go to the next file, which is going to be the index.view for the questionnaire route, is that each individual component is going to act as a single entry point in this barrel file, which will re-export all of our fields components so we can import them cleanly elsewhere. Everyone, lastly, let's go ahead and build out the file that will render the Gravity Forms questionnaire on our Vue/Nuxt front end. And we're going to do that in the pages directory. So in our pages directory, I'm going to add a path called questionnaire, which is represented by a folder. And then we're going to have that file called index.view. Now, let's go ahead and start the first line of code, which is first our script setup block that's going to tell Nuxt we're using the new competition API syntax, so no need for an explicit export default. And then next we're going to pull in our imports and ref for simple reactive values, reactive for nested state, on mounted for lifecycle hooks, and watch to observe changes. We use useFormFields, which gives us a function that maps a Gravity Forms field object to the correct Vue component on the fly. Now following that right here, we import useGravityForm, which wraps the GraphQL query and mutation logic. And it exposes fetch form to load the form structure, submit form to send entries, and form fields right here. And that's a ref that will hold the returned field definitions. Then we have form values here, this const that will be a plain object keyed by field ID, storing whatever the user types or selects. Now, if something goes wrong, fetching or submitting will display this error message at the top. Then right here, we're going to use the validation errors to hold messages for the address subfields and the email fields. Following that, we're going to have a validator function for the address object, which is right here. And this is going to validate address checks, which each piece of the address object, and updates our validation error errors.address accordingly. Now, if any piece is missing or invalid, it's going to return false. Now, here's the validator function for the email string, and this uses validated email uses a regex, regular expression, to check the format, and it updates validation errors.email if it fails. Next, we run a lifecycle hook, and this calls the fetch form, then immediately executes to fire off the GraphQL request. Then after that, let's get this code in here. Essentially, as soon as data updates with an array of fields, we store it in formFields.value and generate a matching empty structure in formValues.value. Right here. If fetching the form fails, we're going to populate down here our global error ref so the user sees a message. Now we have, before sending anything, we have to run our validators for that and stop if any errors remain, which is right here. Next, we're going to go ahead and wrap our submission in a try-catch block right here so we can gracefully handle any errors that occur during the network request on the server. Here we call our submit form composable, passing in the form ID and the user's current values. This performs the GraphQL mutation under the hood and returns whatever the server sends back. Here we're going to check for GraphQL errors, so even if the HTTP request succeeds, the GraphQL response can contain its own errors array. We look at that, and if there's at least one error, we throw it to be caught below, and this saves us from assuming that anything about the shape of response.confirmation here. Now, displaying the confirmation message right here, because assuming the submission was accepted, the API returns a small HTML snippet in confirmation.message. Now, we decode it into plain text, so any tags or styling get stripped and show it in a simple alert, and this gives immediate feedback right here to the user. Finally, we're going to reset the form state here, and we're going to rebuild the form values object exactly as we did on load. Empty arrays for checkboxes, empty strings for text inputs, and fresh nested objects for address and names. So the form appears blank and ready for new submission. Lastly, down here, we're going to catch any thrown errors. This is like if anything goes wrong, network failure, invalid JSON, or one of our manual throw new error calls, this catch block will fire. We surface the error message in an alert so the user knows something unexpected has happened. Now the last block of code that we're going to need is the template wrapper and some styling in Vue. And let's explain what this template wrapper is doing in Vue. Up here, we're going to start with a simple div, and that's container to give our form some padding. Now, inside the first div v-if error checks if an error message actually exists. If so, we render it in red text, and this is our global error state. Next, the div v-else if statement formFields.length handles the loading state. Now, while our form fields array is still empty because the GraphQL fetch hasn't returned yet, and then we show loading form here in this p tag. Now, only once this form field have data do we render the actual form starting here, and that's what v-else here does, and we also attach @submit.prevent equals handle submit so that Vue intercepts the submit event and calls our submit handler without a full page reload. Now, inside the form, we loop over each definition with v for field inform fields, key field.database ID, and for each one we render a dynamic component here. Now, in this component, is equals resolve field component field chooses the right Vue component, input, select, checkbox, etc. based on the field's type. Now we pass the full field object as a prop so the component knows its label, choices, placeholder, and so on. Now, then we bind with v-model to form values field.database ID, giving us two-way data binding. Down here, we render a standard submit button styled with Tailwind. When clicked, it triggers our handle submit method, and that's the entire wrapper with some stylings down here. Okay, great. We're almost done with our application, and we're near ready to test it and run it on the development server. Before we do that, let's go over one last file and the things that we've changed in it, and that's going to be the nuxt.config.ts file. So navigating over there, here is the code. It's 15 lines, and let me just go over what the changes were. So the object I want to go over is this right here. Now this is the runtime config, and this lets us inject environment-specific values at runtime. The public subtree is exposed client-side, and we define the WordPress URL, and which will populate via the environment variable that we placed in at the beginning of the video. And in the code, it's going to be called useRuntimeConfig.public.WordPress URL, and this will hit our Headless WordPress endpoint to grab the data. This is essentially what we're using as our variable. Lastly, down here, we have a route rules function, which is a way to customize how Nuxt serves particular routes. For our questionnaire route, we set pre-render to true, and that tells Nuxt at build time to generate a static HTML snapshot for this route. So when deployed to a static host, the page is ready and instantly doesn't need on-the-fly SSR. Now let's test this out. I have a terminal open here, and let me run the development server with npm run dev. That's spun up. Let's go over to the browser, refresh this, and here's our questionnaire. All right. Now, let's go ahead and test this out and fill out some fields. Here's the first field, which is the address field, and I'm just going to put some dummy data. So 1234 test lane, Beverly Hills 90210. Whoops. And there's the validation telling me that I need to fill out the proper field here. So that's going to be test lane, Beverly Hills, California, United States. And now the next question on this questionnaire is, which Ninja Turtles do you like? And I was always a fan of Donatello. Let me get this page a little bit bigger here. Yep. And then we have a date picker. So let's pick today's date, which is going to be May 1st. And then we're going to put a test email, test the best at gmail.com. And then the next question, scenarios in which you would eat green eggs and ham. This is a multiple select, and I'm going to eat it with a fox. Then we have our name field, and I'm going to put Mr. Franley the Manly. Okay, now just a phone number field here, 567890. What kind of bear do we like best? Let's see, I'm going to go black bear, and that's the radio box. Which was the first Pokemon you've ever acquired? I'm going to go with Bulbasaur on this drop down. And then we have a regular field, which we condensed into one component, which is the input field. And this is how much would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood. I'm going to say a lot. How dare you? And this better be good. That's another regular field. Here's a time picker. And we're going to go, let's see, 6:26 a.m. Now for the website field, let's go https stokedtothemax.com. And then short strings only field this is where the validation happens on the client side, where we just need to put short strings, and I'm going to put short. Okay, we've filled out our questionnaire properly. Let's go ahead and submit it. Cross your fingers and hope it works. Awesome. So we got a pop-up window, which is the behavior we're expecting, because this is what shows us that it did work. It were validated. So it says, thanks for contacting us. We will get in touch with you shortly. When I hit OK, it resets the state of the form to be empty. When I go over to the forms area in my WP admin, I hover over entries and click on that. And there's our form data that we just submitted. There's a test lane, Donatello, the date we picked, the email with the fox we picked, Mr. Franley the Manly, phone number, Black Bear, Bulbasaur, a lot, this better be good, the time, the website stuck to the max, and we typed in short. Awesome. And that concludes our video. I hope this helped you understand how to use forms in Headless WordPress with Gravity Forms, WPGraphQL for Gravity Forms, and Nuxt.js in Vue. As always, I'm super stoked to hear your feedback and learn about the Headless projects you're working on, so hit us up in the Headless WordPress Discord. Special thanks to David Levine and Daniel Rowe for helping me write the code on this, and I will leave all the collateral and links that you need to get this spun up and followed in the YouTube description. Thanks again.